Picture this. A courtroom in 2019. A mother stands before a judge, tears streaming down her face, pleading for custody of her children. Her lawyer presents no financial records, no psychological evaluations, no evidence of stable housing. Just her raw emotion, her desperate love, her visible pain. The father's attorney counters with documented proof of steady employment, a safe home, consistent childcare arrangements. Guess who won? The mother walked out with full custody. 6 months later, Child Protective Services removed those same children due to neglect. The judge had ruled with his heart, not his head, and 3 innocent lives paid the price. This isn't an isolated incident. It's happening everywhere, every day. In boardrooms where CEOs make billion-dollar decisions based on gut feelings, in voting booths where citizens choose leaders who make them feel good rather than those with sound policies. In hospitals where families demand treatments that science says won't work because hope feels better than acceptance. Welcome to Logic over Spirit. I'm here to take you on a journey through one of the most dangerous patterns in human reasoning. We're going to explore why emotional appeals have become the dominant force in modern argumentation, how they hijack our rational decision-making processes, and why this matters more now than ever before. Aristotle called it pathos, the art of appealing to emotion. For thousands of years, philosophers, religious leaders, and scientists have grappled with the tension between what we feel and what we know. Today we live in an age where feelings have been elevated to the status of facts, where saying something offends you has become a legitimate counterargument, where your truth and my truth somehow coexist even when they contradict objective reality. But here's what nobody wants to admit. Emotions are terrible guides for finding truth. They're wonderful for connecting with other humans, for creating art, for falling in love. But when it comes to determining what's actually real, what actually works, what actually serves justice, emotions are not just unreliable, they're actively dangerous. Over the next half hour, we're going to examine this from 3 critical perspectives. Science will show us how our brains are wired to prioritize emotional responses over logical analysis. Religion will reveal how sacred texts have both weaponized and warned against emotional manipulation. And philosophy will help us understand why the greatest thinkers in history have consistently advocated for reason over passion in the pursuit of truth. By the end, you'll never listen to an argument the same way again. Chapter 1. The Neuroscience of Emotional Hijacking. Let's start with your brain. That 3-pound universe sitting inside your skull, making every decision you think is yours. When someone makes an emotional appeal, something fascinating and terrifying happens in your neural architecture. The amygdala, your brain's emotional processing center, lights up like a Christmas tree. This almond-shaped structure evolved over millions of years to keep you alive by making split-second decisions. See something that looks like a snake. Feel fear. Jump back. Ask questions later. This worked beautifully when we were dodging predators on the African savanna. But we're not on the savanna anymore. We're in a world of complex policy decisions, intricate moral dilemmas, and sophisticated arguments that require careful analysis. Yet our brains haven't caught up. When someone shows you a picture of a suffering child, or tells you a heartbreaking story, or raises their voice in apparent anguish, your amygdala responds exactly as it did 50,000 years ago. It floods your system with neurochemicals that prioritize immediate emotional response over careful deliberation. Here's the kicker. Once your amygdala is activated, it actually suppresses activity in your prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain responsible for logical reasoning, long-term planning, and rational analysis. Neuroscientist Joseph Ledoux spent decades studying this phenomenon. His research revealed that emotional responses travel through the brain faster than rational thoughts. The pathway from sensory input to amygdala is shorter and quicker than the pathway to the prefrontal cortex. Emotion wins the race to consciousness every single time. Studies using functional MRI scans have shown that when people are presented with emotionally charged information, their logical processing centers show measurably reduced activity for up to several minutes afterward. You're literally less capable of rational thought when you're emotionally aroused. Politicians know this. Advertisers know this. Trial lawyers know this. That's why they use it. Consider a study published in the journal Psychological Science. Researchers presented participants with identical policy proposals, but framed them differently. One group received dry statistical analysis showing the policy's projected outcomes. The other group heard personal stories about individuals affected by the issue. Both groups received the exact same factual information embedded in their presentations. The story group showed significantly more support for the policy. More importantly, when asked to recall the actual facts about the policy's projected outcomes, the story group performed significantly worse than the statistics group. The emotional framing didn't just influence their opinion, it impaired their memory of the actual facts. This is what psychologists call the effect heuristic. We use our emotional response to a piece of information as a shortcut for evaluating its validity. If something makes us feel good, we tend to believe it's true. If it makes us feel bad, we tend to believe it's false. This happens automatically, beneath conscious awareness. And it's incredibly difficult to override, even when we know it's happening. The pharmaceutical industry exploits this constantly. Think about drug commercials. They don't spend 30 seconds listing benefits and side effects. They spend 25 seconds showing you happy families, beautiful sunsets, people living their best lives. And then rapidly mumble the side effects at the end. They're not stupid. They know that if they can create a positive emotional association with their product, you'll be more likely to ask your doctor about it regardless of whether you actually need it or whether it's the best option for your condition. Social media has turned emotional manipulation into an algorithm. Posts that generate strong emotional reactions, whether anger, fear, or inspiration, get more engagement. So the algorithm shows you more of that content. You end up in a feedback loop where you're constantly exposed to information specifically designed to trigger your emotional responses, while information that requires careful thought and nuance gets buried. The science is clear. Your brain is wired to prioritize emotional appeals over logical analysis. This was adaptive when the biggest threat was a charging predator and you had milliseconds to respond. It's maladaptive when the biggest threats are complex civilizational challenges that require careful reasoning, long-term thinking, and the ability to accept uncomfortable truths. Every emotional appeal you encounter is exploiting an evolutionary mismatch between the environment your brain evolved for and the environment you actually live in. Understanding this doesn't make you immune, but it's the first step toward protecting yourself from manipulation. Now, you might be thinking, if emotional appeals are so effective because of how we're wired, maybe we should just accept them as valid. After all, if humans naturally respond to emotion, isn't that telling us something important? This is where we need to turn to a realm that has thought deeply about human nature, morality, and the distinction between what is natural and what is right. Let's look at what religion has to say about the role of emotion in seeking truth. Chapter 2: Sacred Warnings Against Passion. Every major religious tradition contains explicit warnings about allowing emotions to override reason and divine guidance. This isn't accidental. The founders of these faiths understood something profound about human nature. They recognized that while emotions are part of our humanity, they're unreliable guides to moral truth. In Christianity, the book of Proverbs repeatedly emphasizes this principle. Proverbs 14:12 states, "There is a way that appears to be right, but in the end, it leads to death." The key word here appears. Your emotional intuition about what feels right can lead you catastrophically astray. Proverbs 28:26 drives the point home even harder. Those who trust in themselves are fools, but those who walk in wisdom are kept safe. The Bible consistently positions emotional intuition as inferior to wisdom, which requires study, reflection, and humility. Jesus himself warned against being swayed by emotional appeals. In Matthew 7:15, he cautions, "Watch out for false prophets. They come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ferocious wolves." False prophets don't announce themselves. They appeal to your emotions, tell you what you want to hear, make you feel good about yourself. The warning is clear: emotional comfort is not evidence of truth. Islam places enormous emphasis on reason and knowledge over emotional whim. The Quran repeatedly instructs believers to think, reflect, and use their intellect. In Surah Al-Anfal, it states, "Indeed, the worst of living creatures in the sight of Allah are the deaf and dumb who do not use reason." The Quran doesn't say the worst are those who lack emotion. It says those who don't use reason. Islamic scholarship developed an entire field called ilm al-kalam, rational theology. Precisely because early Muslim scholars recognized that faith without reason becomes superstition, and claims without evidence become tyranny. Consider the Islamic principle of hawa, which refers to base desires and emotional impulses. The Quran warns against following hawa in over 20 verses. Surah Al-Qasas states, "And who is more astray than one who follows his desire without guidance from Allah?" The clear implication is that emotional desire, unguided by rational reflection on divine law, leads to error and harm. Buddhism might be the most explicit in its treatment of emotion as an obstacle to truth. The second noble truth identifies tanha, craving or attachment, as the root of suffering. Emotional reactions, from a Buddhist perspective, are forms of attachment that cloud perception of reality. The entire practice of meditation is designed to observe emotions without being controlled by them, to see reality clearly rather than through the distorting lens of desire and aversion. The Buddha taught his followers to examine claims carefully. The Kalama Sutta, often called Buddhism's charter of free inquiry, instructs followers not to accept teachings based on emotional appeal, tradition, or even the charisma of the teacher, but rather through direct observation and rational analysis. When you know for yourselves that these things are wholesome, these things are blameless, these things are praised by the wise, these things lead to benefit and happiness, then you should enter and remain in them. even in traditions that emphasize mystical experience. There's recognition that emotion must be disciplined by wisdom. Sufism, the mystical branch of Islam, speaks of nafs, the ego self, that must be trained and transformed. The nafs, when undisciplined, operate primarily through emotional impulse. The spiritual journey requires subordinating immediate emotional gratification to higher principles and truth. Here's what's remarkable. These religious traditions emerged in different times, different cultures, different philosophical frameworks, yet they converge on this insight. Emotions are part of human experience, but they must be governed by something higher. Whether you call it reason, divine wisdom, or enlightened awareness. Now, religious skeptics might dismiss all this as ancient superstition. But here's what you can't dismiss. These traditions survived and spread precisely because they contained functional wisdom about human nature. They wouldn't have persisted for thousands of years if they didn't provide useful guidance for navigating human psychology and social organization. The religious warning against emotional reasoning isn't about suppressing feeling. It's about recognizing that strong feelings don't equal valid reasoning. You can feel absolutely certain about something and be completely wrong. You can feel deeply offended by an argument, and it can still be true. You can feel personally attacked by facts, and they remain facts. Throughout history, religious authorities who abandoned this principle and ruled purely by emotional appeal became tyrants. The Inquisition didn't carefully reason through theology. It responded to the emotional satisfaction of punishing heretics. The witch trials weren't based on evidence. They fed on fear and hysteria. Whenever religious movements have devolved into violence and oppression, it's been because they prioritized emotional fervor over reasoned interpretation of their own texts. The great theologians and religious scholars, whether Thomas Aquinas synthesizing faith and reason, Al-Ghazali defending both mystical experience and logical rigor, or Buddhist philosophers developing sophisticated epistemology, all recognized that genuine religious truth must withstand rational scrutiny. Faith that cannot bear the weight of questions isn't faith. It's dogma sustained by emotional manipulation. Religion warns us about the dangers of emotional reasoning from a moral and spiritual perspective. But what about the philosophers, those thinkers who have dedicated their lives to understanding the nature of truth, knowledge, and valid reasoning itself? What do they have to say about this tension between emotion and logic? Chapter 3, The Philosopher's Verdict. For over 2,000 years, philosophy has consistently identified emotional appeals as logical fallacies, rhetorical tricks that may be persuasive but are fundamentally invalid as methods of discovering truth. Aristotle, the father of formal logic, understood this distinction perfectly. In his rhetoric, he identified three modes of persuasion: ethos, credibility of the speaker; pathos, emotional appeal; and logos, logical argument. But in his logical works, the Organon, he focused exclusively on logos. Why? Because he recognized that ethos and pathos might win arguments, but only logos could establish truth. You can have a credible person making an emotionally compelling case for something completely false. Logic is the only tool we have for systematically distinguishing truth from falsehood. The Stoic philosophers took this even further. Epictetus taught, it's not what happens to you, but how you react to it that matters. The Stoics developed an entire philosophy based on the principle that we must govern our emotional responses through reason, rather than being governed by them. Marcus Aurelius, emperor of Rome and Stoic philosopher, wrote in his Meditations, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." But here's the crucial insight from Stoicism. They weren't advocating for emotionless existence. They were arguing that emotions should be the result of correct understanding, not the foundation of it. First, understand reality correctly through reason. Then, your emotional responses will be appropriate to that reality. Reverse the order, and you're building your worldview on sand. The Enlightenment philosophers made this principle foundational to modern thought. David Hume famously wrote, "A wise man proportions his belief to the evidence, not to his feelings about the evidence, not to how he wishes the evidence would turn out, to the actual evidence." Hume understood that humans are emotional creatures, but he insisted that, when it came to establishing what's true, evidence must reign supreme. Immanuel Kant distinguished between hypothetical imperatives, actions you should take if you want a particular outcome, and categorical imperatives, actions you should take, regardless of your desires. His entire moral philosophy was built on the idea that true ethics must be based on rational principles that hold regardless of how you feel. Act only according to that maxim whereby you can at the same time that it should become a universal law. Notice there's no clause that says unless it makes you feel bad. In the modern era, philosophers have developed entire fields dedicated to identifying flaws in emotional reasoning. Logical fallacies like argumentum, ad misericordiam, appeal to pity, and argumentum, ad populum, appeal to popularity, are recognized as invalid, precisely because they substitute emotional resonance for logical validity. Bertrand Russell put it bluntly, The fact that an opinion has been widely held is no evidence whatever that it is not utterly absurd. Indeed, in view of the silliness of the majority of mankind, a widely spread belief is more likely to be foolish than sensible. Harsh, but instructive. Popular emotional consensus means nothing about truth. Karl Popper, one of the most influential philosophers of science, argued that a theory can only be considered scientific if it's falsifiable. Emotional appeals are inherently not something you can prove wrong. If I argue that we should adopt a policy because it makes me feel good, how do you disprove that? My feelings are real to me, but they tell us nothing about whether the policy will actually work. Popper understood that progress depends on our ability to test claims objectively, and emotions cannot be objectively tested. Contemporary philosophers like Peter Singer have built entire ethical frameworks on the principle that we must reason past our emotional intuitions. Singer's arguments about animal rights and effective altruism are deliberately designed to challenge our comfortable emotional responses. He asks us to consider whether our emotional attachment to cute puppies, while we ignore the suffering of chickens, is rationally defensible. Spoiler, it isn't. The philosophical consensus is overwhelming. From ancient Greece to contemporary universities, philosophers have recognized that emotional appeals, while powerful, are fundamentally unreliable methods for establishing truth. This doesn't mean emotions are worthless. It means they're categorically different from evidence, logic, and rational argument. Here's a thought experiment that illustrates why this matters. Imagine two doctors examining the same patient. The first doctor says, "The test results show cancer, but treating it will be painful and expensive, and honestly, I just feel like everything will be okay if we wait and see." The second doctor says, "The test results show cancer. The statistics indicate that immediate treatment gives you a 70% 5-year survival rate, while waiting drops that to 20%. I recommend we begin treatment immediately." Which doctor are you trusting with your life? The one following feelings or the one following evidence? Now extend that principle to every important decision in society. Criminal justice, environmental policy, economic planning, education reform. Would you want these decisions made based on how they make people feel, or based on evidence of what actually works? Philosopher John Stuart Mill wrote, "He who knows only his own side of the case knows little of that." The reason emotional appeals are so dangerous is they make you feel like you understand something when you haven't actually engaged with the evidence or counterarguments. They give you the illusion of knowledge while keeping you ignorant. Philosophy's verdict is clear. Emotional appeals might win arguments in the short term, but they corrupt our ability to discover truth, make wise decisions, and build a society based on justice rather than manipulation. As Plato warned in the Republic, a society governed by emotional appeal rather than reason inevitably descends into tyranny, because demagogues will always be able to stir up fear and desire more effectively than wise leaders can appeal to rational deliberation. So we've seen how science explains why emotional appeals work, how religion warns against their dangers, and how philosophy categorizes them as fundamentally invalid reasoning. The question now is, what do we do with this knowledge? How do we function in a world that runs on emotional manipulation? And perhaps most importantly, what's at stake if we don't? Chapter 4. Living in an emotion-driven world. Let's be honest about where we are. We live in the most emotionally manipulated society in human history. Every institution, from government to media, to education to commerce, has learned to weaponize emotional appeals because they work. The science is clear. The profit motive is undeniable, and most people have no defense against it. Political campaigns no longer debate policy details. They craft narratives designed to trigger fear of the other side and hope in their own promises. Fact-checkers can prove that 90% of political advertisements contain misleading or false claims, but it doesn't matter. By the time the fact-check comes out, the emotional impression has been made. The amygdala has fired. The association has been created. Your brain has already updated its model of reality based on feelings rather than facts. The news media has perfected the art of emotional manipulation. Cable news doesn't inform anymore. It enrages, terrifies, and excites, because those are the emotions that keep you watching through the commercial breaks. Studies show that exposure to emotionally charged news actually decreases people's understanding of complex issues while increasing their confidence that they understand them. You end up more ignorant but more certain. That's not a bug. That's the feature. Social media is even worse. The platforms make money by keeping you engaged, and nothing engages like emotional arousal. Algorithms specifically amplify content that generates strong reactions. Calm/reasoned analysis gets buried. Outrage goes viral. You're not using social media. Social media is using you. Farming your emotional responses for profit. Advertising abandoned rational product comparison decades ago. Coca-Cola doesn't run commercials explaining why their beverage is nutritionally superior. They show you happy families, Santa Claus, and polar bears, because they want you to associate their sugar water with positive emotions. Apple doesn't make rational arguments about processor speeds and storage capacity. They position themselves as the brand for creative, independent thinkers. It's pure emotional association. Even education has been corrupted by this dynamic. The concept of safe spaces and trigger warnings started with good intentions, protecting people from genuine trauma. But it's metastasized into a system where students can opt out of any content that makes them uncomfortable. Universities that once trained students to engage with difficult ideas now shield them from emotional discomfort. The result is a generation that conflates emotional discomfort with actual harm, that treats being offended as a legitimate counterargument, that demands protection from ideas rather than developing the intellectual tools to engage with them. The consequences are catastrophic. Look at public discourse around climate change. The science is overwhelming. The evidence is clear. But instead of rational discussion about solutions, we get emotional warfare. One side shows you crying polar bears. The other side mocks them as hysterical. Nobody's discussing carbon capture technology or nuclear energy trade-offs or economic transition planning. We're just triggering and counter-triggering emotional responses. Consider the criminal justice debate. You can show someone statistics proving that longer prison sentences don't reduce crime, that rehabilitation programs have better outcomes, that the death penalty doesn't deter murder. But then show them a single emotional story about a victim's family seeking closure, and all those statistics evaporate. One story outweighs a mountain of data, because stories trigger emotions, and emotions override analysis. The pandemic revealed this dynamic in terrifying clarity. Public health officials presented data and suggestions, but conspiracy theorists offered emotionally satisfying narratives about freedom, resistance, and distrust of authority. Facts require you to accept uncomfortable uncertainty and change your behavior. Conspiracy theories let you feel smart, rebellious, and in control. Millions chose the emotional satisfaction of conspiracy over the uncomfortable reality of data. People died because of it. Here's what keeps me up at night. Every time an emotional appeal successfully overrides rational analysis, it reinforces the pattern. People learn that emotional manipulation works, so they use it more. We're in a race to the bottom where whoever can trigger the strongest emotions wins, regardless of whether they're right. This is why we're seeing the breakdown of shared reality. It's not that people disagree about solutions. We can't even agree on basic facts anymore. Because we've trained ourselves to evaluate claims based on how they make us feel, rather than whether they're true. Your truth and my truth can coexist in an emotional framework. They cannot coexist in a rational one. Either the earth is warming or it isn't. Either vaccines prevent disease or they don't. Either the election was stolen or it wasn't. There's no emotional middle ground where everyone's feelings are valid on factual questions. The solution isn't to become emotionless robots. The solution is to develop emotional immunity to manipulation. Just as your immune system learns to recognize and neutralize pathogens, you need to train your mind to recognize and neutralize emotional manipulation. Here's how you start. When you encounter an argument, before you evaluate whether you agree with it, ask yourself, is this making me feel something? If yes, pause. That's not evidence the argument is wrong. But it's evidence you need to engage your analytical mind before accepting or rejecting it. Separate the emotional content from the factual claims. Evaluate the facts independent of how they're presented. Second, actively seek out steelman arguments. Don't look for the weakest, most emotional version of positions you disagree with. Find the strongest, most rational version. If you can only argue against emotional caricatures, you don't actually understand the issue. Third, practice proportioning your confidence to the evidence. Hume's principle: if you feel absolutely certain about something, ask yourself what evidence would change your mind. If the answer is nothing, you're not reasoning, you're just rationalizing an emotional position. Fourth, recognize that being wrong is information, not identity. Our egos are deeply invested in being right. When someone challenges our beliefs, we feel personally attacked. That emotional response prevents us from updating our understanding when new evidence emerges. Learn to separate your identity from your beliefs. You are not your opinions. You're the process by which you form them. Fifth, demand better from institutions. When politicians make emotional appeals without substance, call it out. When media outlets prioritize emotional manipulation over information, stop consuming their content. When advertisers insult your intelligence with pure emotional association, don't buy their products. We get the information environment we tolerate. The stakes couldn't be higher. We face civilizational challenges that require rational, evidence-based solutions. Climate change, artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, nuclear proliferation, pandemic preparedness. None of these can be solved by emotional appeals. They require careful analysis, long-term thinking, acceptance of trade-offs. and willingness to implement solutions that might not feel good but actually work. If we continue down the path of emotion-driven decision-making, we will fail. Not because we're not smart enough. Because we've allowed our emotions to be weaponized against our reasoning ability. We've created systems that profit from keeping us angry, afraid, and tribal. And we've lost the cultural antibodies that previous generations had against emotional manipulation. Conclusion: so let's bring this home. Why do emotional appeals win arguments? Because your brain is wired to prioritize them. Because they bypass your rational defenses. Because they're faster, easier, and more satisfying than careful analysis. But why shouldn't they win? Because they're unreliable guides to truth. Because they can be weaponized to manipulate you. Because every major system of thought from science to religion to philosophy has warned against allowing emotions to override reason. Because a society that makes decisions based on feelings rather than evidence is a society that will make catastrophic mistakes. The mother in that courtroom felt love for her children. That emotion was real, but it didn't make her capable of caring for them. The judge felt sympathy for her tears. That emotion was real, but it didn't serve justice. 3 children suffered because adults couldn't separate feelings from facts. That same dynamic is playing out across every domain of modern life. And until we collectively relearn the distinction between emotional appeals and valid arguments, we're going to keep making terrible decisions and wondering why things aren't getting better. I'm not asking you to stop feeling. I'm asking you to stop letting your feelings be the final arbiter of what's true. Feel deeply, love fiercely, care passionately. But when it comes time to evaluate claims, make decisions, or determine what's actually real, engage your reason. Demand evidence. Proportion your beliefs to the data. Accept uncomfortable truths over comforting falsehoods. This channel is called Logic Over Spirit for a reason, not because spirit doesn't matter, but because when spirit and logic conflict, logic must win if we want to live in reality. Your feelings are valid, but they're not evidence. Your intuition is real, but it's not reliable. Your emotional reactions are human, but they're not arguments. The world is complex. The problems we face are hard. The solutions will require difficult trade-offs. None of this will be solved by whoever can trigger the strongest feelings. It will be solved by whoever can think most clearly, analyze most carefully, and accept reality most honestly. So here's what I want you to do. The next time someone makes an argument, whether it's a political speech, a news article, an advertisement, or just a conversation with a friend, practice this skill. Identify the emotional content, recognize how it makes you feel, then deliberately set that aside and evaluate the actual claims. Is there evidence? Is it reliable? Could you be wrong? What would change your mind? It's hard. It goes against every instinct evolution gave you, but it's the only path to actually understanding reality, rather than just feeling strongly about your misconceptions. If this video challenged you, good, you should feel uncomfortable. That means you're learning. But don't stop at the feeling. Think about it, analyze it, see if you can find flaws in my arguments. That's exactly what I want you to do. Not because I want to be proven wrong, but because I want you to develop the skill of rigorous thinking. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Not to attack them, but to start a conversation about how we can all reason better. Hit subscribe if you want more content that prioritizes truth over comfort. And leave a comment telling me where you think I got it wrong. I promise to respond with logic, not emotion. Because at the end of the day, that's all we have. Our ability to reason through complexity, to update our beliefs in light of evidence, and to pursue truth even when it's uncomfortable. That's what separates wisdom from manipulation. That's what separates understanding from ignorance. That's what separates a society that solves its problems from one that just feels strongly about them. Thanks for watching.